Welcome to Leaders of Life Sciences, the podcast where we spotlight the people shaping the future of pharma and biotech. Each episode, we speak with founders, senior execs, scientists, and strategists about how they lead, what drives them, and the real impact they're making on teams, organizations, and the lives of patients. If you want fresh insight into what great leadership looks like in life sciences, you're in the right place. Let's dive in. Manolo, welcome to the. How are you doing today?
I'm fine. I'm always good.
Excellent. Good to hear. Good to hear. So this week we've got Manolo Beelke on the podcast. He's a seasoned leader in med affairs and clinical development, over 28 years of experience in neurology, psychiatry and sleep medicine. He's the founder of Manolo Beelke and Partners, guided pharmaceutical, biotech, med device companies through successful clinical development journeys, and is passionate about transforming leadership theory into practical application, a big part of what we talked about in the build up to the podcast and what we'll talk about today in the podcast as well. So welcome to the show, Manolo. First question I like to ask everybody is, what is the thing when you look back over your career that you'd say that makes you the most proud?
My career, if you like to call this like that, is always a mix between opportunities which occurred and decisions I have taken. So proud I am, if you like, about the ability to understand that something might be worth and to take the right decision at the right time. There's not one single project. Each of them were different, and at the same time they were challenging in some way. So there are even small projects. It's not that when you're reaching a certain level that things are becoming more relevant. It's depending on what you need to face and the challenges you have to consider at this time. So I think maybe if we talk about one thing, it's the combination of leadership and the operational execution which is most triggering me in all these things, because I strongly believe that there are a lot of consultants, experts from a technical perspective. There are people who are managers, but there are very few leaders. And when you would like to execute a clinical trial, for example, or generally a process in an optimal way, you need to think more about leadership. And leadership is not the highest level. Leadership is at all levels, basically. And currently we are trying to combine that through specific leadership coaching and training, where we are helping operationally to do the real and the daily work with a different mindset, basically. Anticipating things which might come up and allowing also not only individuals but also teams and companies to reach areas they have never thought there could be reached, basically. So that's what we are currently doing. That's with RAT Leadership Academy, where I'm working. That's a project I'm very proud about this, because it's not theory, it's practice and theory combined, and it's operational also at the same time.
Awesome. We'll dig into a couple of things that you've mentioned there already. The difference between theory versus practical leadership, and also very interested on the point that you talk about around the difference between being a manager and being a leader. I think everybody would have seen the LinkedIn post that goes up with a list of what is a manager versus what is a leader. For you, how would you describe the difference between a manager and a leader?
In a nutshell, a manager is often considered more a boss, basically. But boss has such a negative meaning that I would not like to use that. For me, a manager is mainly someone who handles ongoing things which are working properly. So if you have a structure which is working, the situation is stable, you don't have challenges, then you have managers. So they're handling the daily operation. When you are facing moments of crisis, when you have restructuring, or you have a merger and acquisition, or you have anything which is changing the equilibrium you have, then you need leaders. So someone who guides the team toward things they have never tried before. That's where leadership comes out. But also in daily practice, you have these small challenges each day, basically. So leadership is not an exception. Leadership should be a standard, if you like, or as we say in medicine, a standard of care somehow. And often we have still the mindset of a manager, which is embedded in a hierarchical structure, and you have X people who are depending on you, and they are executing the work simply because they know that their career is depending on what you are believing about them and how you are evaluating them. A leader is someone different. A leader is someone who allows that each one is growing, even more than with a better knowledge than what you have as a leader. But it helps to bring the whole team forward. That's a difference. And you can have this at each level, and you don't need to have a hierarchical relationship. The real challenge is when you need to be a leader, driving a team, for example, where you have only functional reporting. So you need to convince the people to do what they need to do just to bring the whole project forward. But in theory, they could also say no. There is no leverage you can use, then only your leadership skills, basically. And that's what makes the difference at the end.
Okay, interesting. There's a couple of things there that I'd be really interested in touching on. When you say that people don't have the leverage other than the leadership skills, what gives somebody that in a leadership position and that we defined as a leader? What creates that that leverage, if you like, to help people execute against the plan when they could say no?
That's a good question. And the answer is not simple. So there is not one solution as usual. It's depending on the context and what you need to achieve. So a leader needs to understand the goal which the team needs to achieve, but the leader needs also to understand the process which is required, and then guide the team through, overcome together the hurdles. And often often be associating leading with someone who is making the first step. That's not necessarily the case. You could be as leader also be the last one, checking that everything is good at the back, and you need someone else in doing the first steps, if you like. But you need to bring them there. So a good example of a leader is, for example, Columbus. At this time, they were believing that the earth is flat. Now, he was able, as a leader, despite all the fears the people had, to convince them to go over the ocean when they could not see anymore the landscape. And with all the fear they had, at the end, he succeeded to reach what he had in mind, so to reach the other side of the ocean, basically. And that requires leadership skills, because you need to do something no one has done before. And something similar you see also in nature. So at the Retail Leadership Academy, we are taking often examples from nature, because nature has the advantage that it has tried everything you can think about in a domain of time which is endless, basically. And we, as humans, have only a lead flap, basically, with respect to the time nature had to test everything. Not by chance, most of the ideas from engineers are coming from nature, because they have tested this through try and error, and something worked, and what worked has been continued. What was not working, you don't see anymore. And something similar you can see, for example, with the bees. The bees, when the queen is dying, have a moment of crisis, similar to a corporate where something unexpected has happened. Tariffs, I don't know, trade wars, whatever, a competitor who has become stronger. And the challenge is to react in the right way. And the bees have this way that some workers, we don't know who and why and what is the program they have, is deciding that some of the larvae, which the previous queen has given there, is then nurtured with this royal jelly. And only through the use of this royal jelly, someone who normally would become a normal worker becomes something of exceptional. Now the question is, who is the leader here? Is this the queen or is this the worker? And that's an interesting thing in this whole story, because leading at this point in the moment of crisis is not the queen. It's a group of workers who are deciding who will be the next queen. And then once the queen exists, of course, the queen takes over to some extent the lead. But it's not so much leadership, it's more management at the end, because they're putting again their eggs there and they are allowing the survival of the whole hive but it's not really leadership. It's more management.
A really interesting example. I've not heard that sort of a metaphor around leadership before. For you then, what led you to be so passionate about this? You've clearly given this real deep thought with the examples that you've even used there. So where's this passion for you around leadership in the life sciences world come from?
As a leader, companies are seeking for natural leaders. That's this buzzword of natural leaders. I think that natural leaders does not exist. So there are someone who can more easily become leaders than others, because there might be some sensitivity to that. But at the end, you become a leader. And you become a leader through observing and learning from the challenges you are facing. And that's what is attracting me, because as a consultant, I'm often designing studies, I'm helping to develop clinical development strategies, but the execution of these strategies and the successful execution of these studies is depending on how good the company is able to lead into something new. And often you have companies who are not following new path. They just copy what others have done because they're afraid to be the first one. And here is where leadership comes on. If you would like to be a winner within the competition of the market, you need to be also brave enough and at the same time careful enough to choose a different path. And that's where leadership starts. The smart leadership are those who are going new path but are monitoring each step. So even if you're falling, it's not a problem. So what I'm often saying, and that's another allegory, is leading a company or facing the challenge is like sailing, basically. You cannot decide from where the wind is coming, but you know which harbor you would like to reach. And you need to monitor where the wind is coming and then adapt yourself to the situation. And very few companies have this flexibility. And that's why I'm so passionate about that, because you can have the best product in the world, but if you don't have good leaders, you are just average. You can have a bad product, but you have extremely good leaders, and your bad product is still competitive. And it's interesting. You don't need to have the best product on the market. You need to have the best leaders. And that's the entry point also for thinking about how should we hire people. So what are the criteria we should select? And that's another big question, another big topic where HR is nowadays often not characterized by leadership, basically. They are just copying a job description, often from big companies, trying to adapt them to small companies. Then they're insisting on locations often. So very old-fashioned criteria, basically. And they are often forgetting that what is most important, especially for a startup or a small company, is that you get the best people on the market, not the one from the neighborhood.
And when you say best people, you're not necessarily just talking about the knowledge, but you're also talking about the leadership capability.
The leadership skill, yes.
Yeah.
The best people are not necessarily the technical best people who knows everything. You need also them. But someone who knows everything and is not able to work within a team or lead a team is basically useless. But the classical example I have seen very frequently is a startup is trying to break through the market. And what the first thing they're doing is they're believing that someone from a big company, so for example, big pharma, is helping them in doing that. These poor guys often have no other experience than big pharma. And what they are doing, obviously, is copying the environment they know from big pharma into a small startup. And that's the beginning of the death, basically, because then you're overcomplicating the whole process and you're establishing an environment which is overcomplex. There's no need. And you don't take decisions, because as a startup, you need to be brave. In a big pharma company, or a big company generally, you need more to ensure that you are not fired, basically. That's a big difference. So the strategy is completely different on the corporate level for hiring people, but also for each single person working there in this context.
So when you're looking at the skill set of a leader, what are you looking for?
I'm looking for people who are able to solve problems when they are occurring and they are unexpected. So when I'm doing an interview, for example, I rarely look to the CV, honestly. It's just for me a rough idea of from where it comes. What I'm looking for in an interview is how is the person reacting when the interview is going in a completely different way than what they're expecting. And I am introducing then challenge they have not expected. And then I'm interested to see how they are reacting to that. Because that's what counts at the end in the daily work. You have always troubles, always. And there are people who are starting to scream, and there are people who are solving the problems, being calm and analyzing what could be done. And they're taking a decision based on the knowledge they have in them in this moment, knowing that the knowledge is limited, but taking a decision. Because the worst thing you can do is not to take any decision. Many people are believing that not taking any decision means you don't make mistakes. But that's exactly the mistake. Because not taking a decision means you leave the boat to the wind. You don't change the sailings. You don't change anything. You leave it to nature, basically. And if you survive or not is not depending anymore on yourself. That's not leadership. That's just
the way you
following.
describe it, and the way I've talked with a couple of people recently who echo a similar point. It sounds like it's making a decision without the guaranteed knowledge of the outcome, which also puts the leader at risk of failure. So, what's your take on people taking that risk and exposing themselves to this kind of, quote unquote, failure situations?
No, I worked once in a company where they had one saying, so it was a flat structure, and the CEO said, "We are not afraid to do mistakes because we are monitoring each step we are doing." And that's the right approach. Making a mistake is not the problem. Not reacting to the mistake, that's a problem. And also blaming someone for having taken a wrong decision is, from a philosophic point of view and from a culture perspective, a mistake. Such a person is toxic and should be taken out from the team, because you don't need these people. You need people who are solving the problem. And if the ship is sinking, you need someone who is acting, not someone who is blaming someone else who did the mistake. Who cares? When you are sinking, the problem is to survive, not to blame someone and to understand who was responsible for that.
If we go back a little while in the conversation, you're talking about the difference between theoretical leadership and real world leadership. What do you think gets lost when people are just talking from the perspective of theory versus what is learned from learning leadership practically?
There are many coaches on the market, and in most of the cases, they're giving you advices which are perceived by the auditorium as not fitting to their situation. So that's a problem. So an advice is as good as the reality from which this advice derives. So if it's just a theoretical context which is not fitting to the auditorium, why are you giving this advice? Is this because it's the only thing you know? The first thing you should do is analyzing the situation. It's like a physician, if you go to a company and you would like to help the company, making an off-site meeting with some theoretical leadership skills development is often perceived as a time off to have some party. That's what it is. But that should not be the goal of that. The goal should be different. So, for example, unifying the team or helping to analyze better or understanding the different psychological profiles which are acting together in a team or whatever. But what you are trying to teach cannot be your portfolio you have. If you are a good coach, you need to understand, first of all, like a physician is doing a diagnosis, you need to collect the symptoms, the signs, then make the diagnosis. And only once you have the diagnosis and a clear idea what the disease is, then you can talk about treatment. And these things should be based not on gut feeling, but on at least semi-quantitative measurements. You need to have something which you can replicate so that you can measure if there is an improvement. If everything is just a subjective perception, then it's difficult to measure. And if you cannot measure, then how do you know that there is something going in the right direction? If I cannot measure fever, how can I know that my treatment was good?
I think this is a point that's been raised previously around the difficulty in measuring leadership improvement. How do you advise people to, what should they be measuring, what should they be tracking to determine whether or not the leadership has become more effective, or is it just a case that we're in a good moment in the market that appears like good leadership? What's the difference?
Yeah,
How
you
can
need,
you measure for that?
that's a huge difference in our Arete Leadership Academy. What we are using are tools which are allowing to measure in the domain of time the changes. And so we are applying a scientific approach to changing the behavior and leadership at the end. And we are doing this on individual level, team level, and the corporate level. And the tools you are using are depending on many two factors. So which level we have, so it's an individual who needs to learn to lead themselves, or is it an individual who needs to learn to guide a team, or is it the team who needs to interact together, or is it a corporate problem where often the executive board is the root cause of the whole situation you have. So we are analyzing that, and we are not using one tool. There is not one thing you can do. It's depending on what you need to measure. And often it's also very simple tools, basically. Just semi-quantitative scale, for example, which is measuring your perception. And then you put this in a context of multiple perceptions, and together they create an average value. And this average value, within a range of variability you have, is telling you a lot. But not the average value alone, but also the spreading of the answers. If you have huge spreads of answers, the perception is huge, you need to understand why. And that's another important thing at the end. If you don't try to understand why the perception is different, it's difficult to address each single subgroup. The nice thing so when you have a merchant acquisition, you have very often the situation that there are mainly two groups of people. One who are more afraid about the change, and those who are embracing the change because they was waiting that finally there is some change. So there's a group of hope and there's a group of fear, basically. And the way how they're coping with the external situation of changes, for example, introduced through an acquisition, is important because you cannot treat these two groups in the same way. You need to understand the starting point they have. And then you need to address the goal they need to achieve. And you need also to understand who of this group I can take forward and who of these will be kept behind, because that's how it is. It's always also selecting. Not everyone is reacting in the right way to a situation of change. And the question is, would I like to have them all in the new structure? Or would it be better we find a solution for those who are not able to cope with the change? Because there could be a burden for the others. It's not an easy decision to take. It's very hard. But that's also leadership, because at the end, your responsibility is for the corporate level or for the whole team. So you need to ensure that the hive is surviving. That's what you need to ensure. And if you need to sacrifice someone, it needs to be done, even if it's a hard decision. The way how you're doing that is also, again, a sign of leadership, because you can do this in a very rough, hard way, or you can do this in a smooth way, so that at the end they are thankful for another opportunity they get. It's not always about firing people. Understanding what their needs are and where they might feel more comfortable at the end.
Do you think people within this industry, within pharma, biotech, do you think they face specific challenges or unique challenges compared to other industries?
But pharma is a very conservative environment. Often you are trying to do what has always been worked. So the real challenge is in convincing them that something of new is not really new because others have done this already. And you need to start here also from where they are. many people have never tried something else and they're feeling comfortable in repeating each time the same thing. The question is, however, is this really the best choice for the company and for the product? How will we end up forecasting what will happen once you reach the market? And in pharma, we are talking about very long windows of development. Can be also in some situations about 10 years. So forecasting what will be the market in 10 years is a big challenge. It's not easy. But there are ways to do that. And there are also ways in thinking to shrink this time period so that instead of 10 years, you do the same thing in 3 years or 5 years. And often, the real challenge is finding the right indication. So often we are working with indications which are suboptimal, and you are patching them around just to make it fit. If they would have chosen another indication or multiple indications developed in several waves, for example, it would be smarter, commercially more interesting, better risk mitigation. But you need to convince the people to do that. Okay. And that's a challenge. You know?
What do you think that challenge, like, what do you think it takes to be able to find that indication, find the right indication early?
So ideally, you have even not started with preclinical work. So you have just a product which have, for example, in vitro, shown an effect. And then you analyze what could be, from the mechanism of action perspective, at the level you know, be indications which could work. And often it's not only one. Often you have 10 different, some of them rare diseases, some are not. And then the question is, what are the commercial opportunities for each of them? What is the likelihood of success within the clinical development? How much can we mitigate the risks within this clinical development? And what are the data we currently have to build this up, the whole story? And these 3-4 perspectives together are then, in theory, driving you to decide which is the best indication. Rarely they are doing that. Very often they are either trying to copy someone, or they are going in an indication because it's trendy, or because someone told them in academia that this could be a product which can work in that indication, because the whole, and it's biased of course, because the whole research they're doing is only in this indication and they are not expert outside of any other indication. Very rarely they are considering the commercial environment. So very often 1 year before the launch, they are all running to make a launch team and creating the market. But very rarely it's an ideal scenario, and that's why you need then marketing, patching here, patching there, and it's not ideal. And if you are a small company, you don't have the budget for that. So you need to be smarter upfront. And that's why, especially for a small company, it's critical to find the right indication at a very early stage, especially if you don't plan to reach the market, but to have an early exit and to sell everything. Because you need to understand what is the demand of the market at the time you are ready to sell it. What are the people more looking for? Where can I sell it better? Which is the indication I can sell it better? Or I'm developing maybe a program where I have planned already 2 other indications and I'm trying this in a small one just to show that it works.
What are the problems that you often see and what's missing in those that are not doing this right early on?
The problem is that they don't have a clue. That's the problem. They don't have the understanding of that. Very often, especially in small companies, it's like 4 friends meeting at a bar, deciding together to set up a company. That's very often the situation. And that's okay, fair enough. But then you need at an early stage to take people on board who can guide you. So it's a lack of leadership again, which is lacking often.
So if we've got 4 friends that are listening that are due to meet up tonight at a bar and build a business, they need to make sure they've got somebody thinking long term ahead.
Yeah, it's critical. So either you have already someone inside, so ideally the chief executive officer. Rarely it is. Often they're coming from a completely different field. Or you are thinking about the chief medical officer who needs, however, not to be only an expert in one indication. Then he is selling you this indication because he does not know anything else. It has to be a strategist, basically. That's what you need. Someone who is analyzing and solving problems. Someone who is hands-on. especially if you're a small company, you don't need someone who needs then an assistant and 5 other people that can delegate the work. At least not at this stage.
Do you know any good strategists, Manolo?
There are someone.
In this room on this podcast.
We are doing this very frequently, but there are also others. There are some good ones. That's not the problem. It's only that you need to seek for them. So it's more the problem to take them for that. And if you have someone who has really experience, they are not necessarily cheap. Now, I understand that founding is always an issue, but then we need to find a good story so that we find good investors. So that's another important thing. So you need to have someone who's able to attract foundings, convince investors, and you need a good story to tell. And so these are the kind of people you need at the end. And they are on the market. It's not that they are not existing. It's only that they are not necessarily the cheapest. On the other side, not the most expensive one are necessarily the best one. That's also not true. So, and here you have another challenge. Identifying the right person is a challenge. But you have this in any situation. Finding a good lawyer is also difficult.
What are you seeing as I guess, the themes, the trends? What's coming up in your mind over the next sort of 18 months, 2 years that people listening in should be aware of?
In terms of leadership or in terms of clinical development?
In terms of clinical development.
But in terms of clinical development, obviously there are a lot of things which are going on, which are changing completely the way on treating. So I'm not, just to make an example, there's a lot of companies working on stem cells, which traditionally worked in oncology, thinking now to apply the same in neurology, for example. And that's possible. But the setting is completely different. In oncology, the willingness to pay is high, even if the people are because for stem cell therapy, you are not surviving for 5 years. If you treat them, you can even have a cure. And therefore, the expectation between death and non-death, so surviving for a long, long time, have a long life, is huge. And the willingness to pay is therefore huge. That's different for a chronic disease in neurology, for example. When you are thinking, and there are companies who are thinking to use stem cells to treat multiple sclerosis, and they might even have a cure here. The problem is that the costs are so high and it's so complex that you have on the other side the third payers who need to ask themselves, I'm willing to pay that for that, because if they survive, then if they have a cure, it's not that they're dying. They're just living some years more with respect to a cure, to a treatment which is not a cure, but the life expectation more or less is the same. Not at the same level of quality, and they're getting dysfunctional over time, fair enough. But from a third payer perspective, as dramatic as it might sound, it makes a huge difference between paying 1 million for one person or spending this 1 million for 100 persons. No. And that's a challenge. And there are many of these challenges because the new treatments are highly personalized. Some of them are real cures, but they are extremely expensive. So the challenge is to find a good strategy on one side for the company, and on the other side, putting yourself in the shoes of who needs to pay for that. And these are completely different challenges with respect to the past. So in the past, it was more about fitting to the regulatory requirements. Nowadays, the health economic and outcome research hurdle, so the so-called fifth hurdle, is more important, more critical, because you need to show that at the end, there is a cost saving in the ideal case, or somehow there is a benefit for the society. If you don't show that, you will have a problem. And there are examples already of products which were extremely effective but extremely expensive at the same time. So and they have disappeared from the market because there were not enough patients or patients willing to pay for it, or third payers willing to pay for it, because the indication was not ideal, at least for this indication and for the time period in which they have been developed.
So sitting in your seat with the viewpoint that you have on the market and where things are on the industry and where things are heading, what advice do you have for people looking forward to stay relevant, to stay ahead, whether that's from a clinical development side, from a leadership side, but like real, like in the context for leaders of where the market is or where the industry is heading?
Yeah, so my general recommendation is to consider more alternative study designs, which can be adaptive designs of any kind, basket designs. So there are fancy designs which are not so new, but they are not so commonly used. They are more used in oncology, but outside of that, they are rarely used, but simply because the people are not aware that there could be a solution. And if you are proposing these type of things, there is of course sometimes a little bit more work in discussing with health authorities, FDA and EMA upfront. But if you do this in a proper way, you are mitigating at the same time enormously the risks and the time to market. So it's an added value and the time is not wasted. And also the costs which have are peanuts compared to the total cost you would have if you would not apply that. And that's something which is lacking. So often the people are looking to the total costs, but not the relative costs of something. And my advice is to consider more, even if when you are hiring people, just to come back to HR, to consider more the relative costs. So what is the added value someone is bringing with respect to the absolute cost? Or in other terms, how forward is the return of your investment? That's a big question. And not how much does it cost now? How much does it cost now is just is a challenge, but also an opportunity, because it means we need to have more foundings, better founding for more investors. We need to convince more investors. But if the story is good and the data you have are sound, it's not so difficult to convince investors.
And if a senior leader is listening to this at the moment and wanting to improve, from your experience of coaching leaders and developing leaders, and you could only give one piece of advice, one thing to start doing today, what would you advise them to do?
Everything starts with yourself. So leadership starts by learning to lead yourself. And leading yourself means in the daily work I'm doing, wherever your level is, whatever your level is, whatever your tasks are, you have challenges. And what you need to achieve is clarity. Clarity before you take the decision. Clarity in relation to the data you can get and focusing on the things you have an influence, so you can change, and not distracting you by the things you cannot change, like, for example, the direction from where the wind is coming. That's what leadership is, and it starts with yourself. So self-awareness about what you really need, what your real goals are. And, the classical Pareto principle can be a good guidance on that. So try to focus on the 20%, which is leveraging on 80% of what you need to achieve. Identifying this 20% should be your main task of the day. And if you then spend 5 hours on that and only 3 hours in executing that, that's a good balance. It's not a bad balance. It could be a good balance because the 20% you have identified will then do automatically the rest. Right. So don't hurry up, basically. Take the time to take the right decision with clarity and awareness.
Nice. Good practical advice. Spend some time to figure out where your energy is best spent to get your return on your time.
When the fox is coming to the chicken box, it doesn't help you to run around. Think first of all, where is the fox before you run?
I like that. Nice visual. Manolo, thanks very much for your time. Is there anything else that you would want to leave the audience with? Anything that around where they can get in touch with you if they're looking for help with leadership or strategy or direction or any of that kind of stuff that we've talked through today? Where can people get you?
So my message is always the sailing message. Take the journey as a sailing exercise. drive the team together and achieve what you need to achieve with the team on a sailing boat. So adapt yourself, be flexible. That's my take-home message.
Well, thank you very much for your time. I appreciate you sharing your thoughts and your insights, and look forward to hearing what the audience have to say about the episode today.
Thanks. Bye. Have a nice day. Take care.
Thanks for listening to Leaders of Life Sciences. We hope you're leaving with fresh ideas and inspiration to lead with clarity and purpose. If you're hiring, building your leadership team, or thinking about your next move, we'd love to support you. You'll find everything you need to get in touch in the show notes. And if you enjoyed the show, please follow and share it with someone who'd find it valuable. Until next time, keep leading forward.